it is 11:30. We've got 1 minute till we start. I guess we're live, and so I will say welcome everybody to this session on immigration and labor markets in developing countries. I'm David McKenzie, and we will be delighted to hear from our three speakers. I've said we're letting 1 minute for people to join in. I see Francisco is just joining now, so your discussant is now here, Sandra, as well. So this is excellent. So why don't you get your slides up and get ready to go, and this way we'll keep everyone on track. So thanks.
Super. All right. Let me know if you can see the screen.
Yep.
Okay, super. Let me just make this big. Okay. Let me know when you want me to begin, David, and I'll follow through.
Yeah, please begin.
Okay. So just a brief thank you to Hillel and Shaglar and all the organizing committee for putting together this amazing conference. So this is now one of the repeated times that I've been attending, and I have to say that this is one of the conferences that I very much looking forward to every year. So again, thanks. I know this is a lot of work, so very grateful. So the paper that I will present is joint work with Dani Bajar and Ana Maria Ibanez. And what we're going to do, just to kind of give you an overview, is we're going to evaluate the labor market impacts of a very large amnesty of undocumented migrants that took place in Colombia. And this corresponds to Venezuelan migrants arriving to Colombia. And so just as a very, very short motivation, I just want to kind of point out that most of the forced migration that takes place in the world is actually received by developing countries, approximately 85% of the migration. And the developing countries have a large spectrum of responses towards how much or how generous they are with refugees. So we have everything from Bangladesh, who's very restrictive, and they don't allow refugees to have a lot of mobility. They are concentrated in camps. Until very recently, they actually were granted access to internet. They're not allowed to work. You have a lot of variation in countries that maybe allow refugees to work if they have a sponsor or in certain sectors. And on the other spectrum, there are countries like Colombia. And this is a very generous country, the one that is the most generous as far as I know so far. And they are offering irregular migrants a full regularization, full mobility, with also access to social welfare. So what we're going to do is kind of study what were the impacts of this program. So there has been some existing evidence, and most of it has been focused on programs that are partial. When I say partial, I'm just trying to refer to the fact that it is kind of localized in the characteristics of migrants according to their education or their sector or their sponsor if they have someone who have hired them. And it's mostly focused on the northern countries, so Europe, the US, Canada, that's where we have some evidence. So what we're going to do in this paper is that we're going to evaluate this large-scale regularization. And very interestingly, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the program in a second. It is a very sudden event. Interestingly, and very good for identification and for the consequences that this might have, they didn't have major provision or eligibility criteria to classify for the program. So we are the only exception is that they had to be able to show that they were born in Venezuela. But most citizens in the country, approximately 99.9% of them, have their cédula de ciudadanía, which is like their driving license, say, the equivalent of what we would be in the US. And with that, they would be able to actually show that they were Venezuelans. Another very interesting thing about this program is that we have very large informal sector, and so that's going to map directly into the impacts of that this program may have, and might actually create very different consequences to what we would expect on a country like the US or any country in Europe, where the informality is modest. Okay, so that's the question. We're going to focus on the labor market impacts of this very large program. So, because there is not a lot of time, I'm not going to dwell a lot into the details, but I imagine that many of you are familiar with the Venezuelan crisis. So, the Venezuelan crisis is a political crisis that began with the election of Hugo Chavez, and it kind of intensified with his successor, Nicolas Maduro. And so, Venezuela was a very prosperous country. So when I was young, I remember I am Colombian, so I actually live in Colombia for 26 years. And I remember everyone in Colombia went to Venezuela for vacations, bring technology from Venezuela, went to work to Venezuela. Well, today that changed, and now Venezuela is one of the poorest countries of the region. So from 1996 until 2008, there was a 15% contraction in GDP. Unemployment is rampant, more than 40, almost 40%. Poverty rates calculated approximately 90% of the population. There's shortages of food, of medicines. There is insecurity, repression to the opposition of the government. And so, no surprisingly, this has created a huge outflow of people. And the main receptor is Colombia. So here in your right, you see the Latin American map. The darker the country, the darker, the more reception of refugees that this country has experienced. So by 2019, approximately 4.5 billion people left the country, and approximately of those, 1.8 million people were registered in Colombia as people who were living there and staying in the country. So in 2018, the government decided to do this amazing initiative, which is called the Administrative Registry of Venezuelan Migrants. It's abbreviated RAM for its name in Spanish. And it was supposed to be a census in which they were going to collect data of all the irregular migrants that didn't have migration documents in Colombia. And they did it all across the country, and they collected information on approximately 500, half a million people, more or less. And then this was not meant to actually offer any benefits or anything like that. But later on, in July, the government decided that they were going to use this census to offer a regularization. So anyone who was in that census was offered the possibility of getting the PEP, which was a special permit to actually be able to access the formal labor market. And approximately of these 442 million individuals, 63% or 281,000 individuals applied for the PEP. So how do you apply for this program? You needed to be registered on the census. You needed to be in Colombia. You needed not to have any criminal records. You needed to be able to show you were a Venezuelan migrant. And once you registered on the census, I just want to say this because if we're going to use it for identification, you were given a random registration number, which was meant to smooth the load on public officers. So this is something that we're going to need, and this is why I am mentioning it here. And then once you have all those requirements, what you will have basically go online, fill a form, which would take you 20 minutes or something like that, and print a page, and that's going to be your temporal special permit. So interestingly, this was a very generous program. It not only offered you the possibility of accessing the labor markets, but it also allowed you the possibility to, well, theoretically, be scored by the CISBEN, which is the main proxy score used in Colombia so that people could access any social service. So when I say theoretically, it's because then when we talk to migrants, we realize there were some bottlenecks that sometimes prevented them to actually getting scored by the CISBEN. And so once you have this score, you are going to be eligible for the complete health services in Colombia. The migrants still have access. Any migrant has access to health, but only emergency services. So with this, they would actually be granted all of these services. They would be actually able to get a bank account, and again, well, the work permit, which is the center of our paper, right? So what we're going to do is basically just a difference in different strategy. I'm going to tell a little bit of what the identification will come from. And so in this equation, I will just briefly describe a couple of parts of the equation and kind of ask you to go for details to the paper due to restrictions in our time. But basically, we have our outcomes are going to be labor outcomes. I'll describe them in a second. And we're going to have each individual in each department. We're only going to have 23 departments in Colombia because that's where the data is representative. We're going to have monthly data as well. And we're going to just use the intensity of the program. So how many people were actually legalized inside or regularized inside each department as a percentage of the population, the working age population. So this is going to be like the intensity of the treatment in each city. And this is going to be a dummy or indicator variable for post-treatment. That's it, of course. And we're going to have a battery of controls that I'm not going to describe here so that I can focus on showing you a lot of more interesting things. But I invite you to kind of check this on the paper. So the problem with doing this and just doing a different this is that there is dynamic endogeneity. When I say dynamic, I mean migrants are choosing the location where they are going to live based on considerations of how the economy is doing, and they actually are doing this all the time. And so if we kind of ignore that, we will be biasing our effects. So presumably we're going to find that all the ones who applied for the program are located in cities that are doing better. And that's going to be biasing our results upwards. So what we're going to do is that we're going to instrument only the intensity of the program, because the temporal part of the program, which is it was implemented after August of 2018, was exogenous. The government just woke up one day, it was the president, Juan Manuel Santos, and decided that he was going to legalize all of this or regularize all of these migrants. Even his government didn't have any idea of his plans. So we're going to argue that this is exogenous. So for this part then, what we're going to use is this number that I mentioned earlier, which is this registration number. So when someone registered for the census, it was given a registration number. And it was supposed to be exogenous, and the idea was to kind of smooth the load of officers so that they could enter the information in a more, let's say, coordinated way and not be overwhelmed by the registrations. And so what we do is we actually estimate a weighted average of how much time each individual had in each department to kind of calculate an average registration day that each city had for the registration on the PEP. And this is what we're going to use for identification. Let me show you a little bit and convince you that this is actually creating variation, because I know that might create concerns. So here I am showing you the daily flow and the total stock of PEP registrations in Colombia. So remember, the program opened in August and it closed in December of 2018. And here the flows are going to be these gray bars, and the red bars are going to be the stock. So all I want to illustrate with this graph is that the red line, the stock, has a positive slope. So there was a positive registration all across the time of the program was open. And more importantly, we're going to see that those departments that had a higher average registration days on average actually saw more PEP registrations. So here each dot is going to be a department, and here we're just kind of introducing a linear feet or a quadratic feet just to illustrate that this relation is positive, and that in fact those departments that had more registration days than average saw a larger registration of PEP migrants. So here, what I just wanted to illustrate is that, of course, there's going to be many concerns about how exogenous or how our exclusion restriction is really satisfied. And so what we do here is basically we take data by the department. Remember that there is only 23 observations. And we run these average registration days, this weighted average we created in different department variables observed at baseline before the program was implemented. And what we see here is that there's not really a significant correlation between any of those. And what we wanted to kind of illustrate is that this variable that we're going to use as instrument is not correlated, for example, with population or labor market trends at baseline, or growth, economic growth measured as GDP, as average nightlife density, or violence, or government activity, or geographic characteristics, or even the location of foreigners before the program was implemented. So any of these actually show up to be significant. So there is some robust evidence that this actually was a quasi-random experiment. So what is the data that we're going to use? So very simple. Labor force surveys, monthly, observed for the 23 departments in Colombia. And this is actually the geographic level at which these surveys are significant, representative of the whole country. And this is why we only use that geographic division. We're going to focus on the time periods between January of 2018 and February of 2020. And then we have the census of migrants, and we're going to use that also in our estimations. So what are we going to study? We're going to study the effects that this regularization had on, thank you, on Colombian, Venezuelan, and Colombian returnees, and we're going to focus on weekly hours worked, monthly wages, employment, and labor force participation. So I only have 5 minutes, but don't panic because it's going to be very simple for me to show you the results. So long story short, we do not find a very significant effect of the program. So I want you to focus here on this line, this red line, and you can see here the effects of the treatment on the outcomes that we're studying, and there is really a very precisely zero estimation. This effect here is very, very small because this variable here is the logarithm of the share of PEP holders. So you have to actually divide this by 100. So this is a very negligible effect, so nothing really significant. And the same for the informal sector. So this is for the formal sector, where we would expect the Venezuelans to enter. Nothing there, nothing on the informal sector. We check the Venezuelan sample, and for them, we actually see also a very small effect in formal employment, which is what we expect. But this is not significant when we correct, for example, standard errors to a low number of geographic units. Then we run a battery of robustness tests. I would say that we did anything we could think of that could actually bias our estimates. So if you have better ideas of what things we haven't tested for, please let us know and we will try those. And then the question is, why? Why are Venezuelans not entering the formal sector? So the first thing we did is we go and we check the aggregate data to see whether Venezuelans were actually registering more in the social services as formal workers. And there's nothing there. We don't see any impacts. So what could be happening? So maybe they're not interested in formalizing, right? That could be very much it, that they already have an informal job and they don't want to pay taxes and they don't see any benefit of those. So we test this idea with, oh, it's not working. Oh, okay. What we test is basically whether there was a formal premium for entering the labor market. So is it true that those workers that enter the formal labor market are actually earning more money? Well, it turns out yes. Formal workers almost earn twice as much as an informal worker. So it can be that they are not motivated to joining the informal sector. Well, but maybe another explanation is that they don't have information. That's possible, and there's nothing that we can actually do as of now with the data that we have to actually show or test for this. So we're collecting surveys with Venezuelan migrants to be able to test this hypothesis. And the other possibility is that firms are not interested in Venezuelan workers. Maybe there is large transaction costs, there is lack of information, or they just dislike migrants. So this part, we have a little bit of qualitative evidence on this. So we actually carried out qualitative interviews with refugees, Venezuelan refugees in Colombia. And of course, this is only, let's say, anecdotal evidence, not anything quantitative. And it seems that they seem to be very concerned about the fact that despite the existence of this permit, they are not being offered formal jobs because there is some bottlenecks and some discrimination from firms. So this is something that we are going to try to see prove in another paper. So what are we doing right now? So right now, we're trying to evaluate the impact of the PEP program on Venezuelan migrants themselves. So on their labor market, on their well-being, on their mental health, and on their health as overall. And the reason is because this PEP program actually offered them access to health services and other social programs. It is possible that even if they don't formalize, it still has positive effects for them because they feel empowered, because they feel that they are now legal in Colombia, and of course for their mental health and their health in general with this pandemic, this could have a very positive effect for migrants. So we're currently piloting that instrument. So I imagine I am almost out of time, right, David? Okay, so just to kind of give a conclusion, no effects of the program, and we're trying to understand why this is happening, and the qualitative evidence suggests that it is because despite the fact that Venezuelans are interested, the firms are not actually hiring them actively as of now. So that's it. Thank you for your time and interest.
Great. Thanks so much for keeping on time, and we'll turn over to Francisco for a discussion. And if you have comments after that, put them in the chat, and then we'll have a few minutes for comments at the end. Thanks.
Okay, so hello everyone. Let me share my screen. So it was a really pleasure to read this paper, and which is very interesting and well structured. I think has a huge policy relevance because it really looks at a major refugee crisis in a context which has not been explored so far. So very important. I'm obviously very sympathetic with this research agenda. And so what they do, they basically do two things. So they look at legalized workers and they look at natives. Actually, the first look at natives and then legalized workers. And so the effect of the amnesty. And so the first part, looking at legalized workers, is relatively uncontroversial in the sense we kind of know what's the effect of getting legal status on employment and wages. There is evidence for the US, for Italy, for Spain. And so the second part, I mean, the impact on natives is what I think is more important, more novel, let's say. Although I would say, I think in this presentation now, there is some work by Ciasambuli Perry and Elias Morras and Vassos Greno. I think Morras was now cited in the presentation by the paper, which actually tried to do exactly that, so looking at the impact on natives. So the best ingredients, so the things I like the most about the paper is a really this measure and explore setting, a very large policy experiment. So we're talking about the legalization of 1% approximately of Colombian population. So if you compare it with the US legalization of 1986, that was kind of like was larger in size, but as a share of the population was kind of smaller. So just to put that in the context. And the identification strategy is novel and is interesting. But right on that, I've got most of my comments on there. So this idea of having this variation at the district level in time window to apply is very interesting, and it's very credible that if you, well, depending on how many days if you have more days to apply, clearly you will see more applications to be being filed in. And this is very credible at the individual level. So people had to register for this census, which occurred like 2 years before, and then all of a sudden the president decided to give these people a legal status according to this number. So at the individual level, I'm perfectly fine with identification. I'm starting to understand the source of variation at the district level. So in this sense, I would say that, I mean, the law of large, if this comes from the same distribution, the law of large numbers should apply, and the average waiting time should be identical but very similar across districts, since that you're working with 500,000 people. And so I'm really scratching my head. So you emphasize in the paper that the allocation of the number to the individual was exogenous, and that's fine, which doesn't mean that it's random. So clearly the concern here is that if the assignment of this number reflects the order in which these people register for the census, or the order in which these kind of registration centers were open to record these people, then it's not random, either at the individual nor at the regional level. And in fact, there is a kind of a plot twist in the paper, because you show the table that you've shown to us, which, by the way, I think is a regression of 21 regressor on 23 observation. But then there is a plot twist in the sense that then you reveal later on that actually the average time is correlated with the distance to the border with Venezuela, which suggests that basically the exposure to the flow. So basically, I think it suggests that the regions which are more exposed to the flows and which probably receive the flows, were the first to receive the flows, are also those who have I'm not sure whether longer or shorter waiting time, but it's systematically correlated. And then clearly it's very problematic with the exclusion restriction. And the other concern,
Francisco, yeah, one minute left.
Yeah. Other concern is really the little variation you have. So you have very few points, and which comes from the labor force survey. And so I'm wondering if there is any way of exploiting more variation. And even if I like very much the idea of this IV, it's novel, but maybe you could benchmark with other IV early settlements of Venezuela, distance from the border. You have previous legalization, maybe you can use them somehow. Last comment I'll have. I think there is an issue with the attraction of, so if whether the legalization attracted more Venezuelan migrants, and you suggest this is probably the case. So this is a concern, is an omitted variable which you cannot really deal with the IV. And so that's also something that maybe there are data to test that, and whether there was a higher inflow in areas where you legalize more people. And this may also, this recall network effect may explain your absence of findings. So you legalize a certain number of people and you get even more undocumented Venezuelan. So then the effects you find are pretty much zero. And I fly on the last comments of findings. So clearly, I mean, the legalization is a relabeling of workers who are already in the economy, and it doesn't necessarily change their productivity, their employment, or their sector allocation. And clearly, if there is an effect on natives, there must be first an effect on legalized immigrants. And I'm trying to understand the size of it. I would like to see whether basically formal employment increased overall or not. So if you legalize this many migrants, they enter the formal labor market, how many natives eventually displaced? And this is the only way for me to understand whether it's a negligible or not, or non-negligible effect. And then I've got a number of minor comments, which I will send you via email. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thanks, Francisco. So I don't see any questions straight away. So Sandra, do you want to take on this law of large number point, which I think is a kind of key one that I also had when I was looking at this, and we'll see if anyone else has got other comments.
Super. So Francesco, first of all, thank you. You always have great comments that would improve the paper already. There's a number of things that we have already tried from the things that you mentioned. It is important to say, and I would try to bring that up earlier in the paper, that the average number or our instrument is correlated with distance to the border. But one thing that we actually test for is what happens when we control for that variable, and the results are basically unchanged. We also check for all of the employment, and we don't see any impacts in overall employment. And we have also used alternative instruments. So one of the alternative instruments that we have used is early settlements of Venezuelans, instead of using the average number of days, and the results are very, very similar. And we don't find any impact of the program with using those. We thought, however, that this instrument was a little bit more novel, and this is why we kind of use it in the main estimates. But we definitely will try to explain more where the variation is coming from. So as of now, because we're running regressions and not seeing a lot of variation, we don't have any answer on that. But I will try to explore that and include it in the paper. I guess with that, there is not much else that I would like to answer. All the other comments are very relevant and interesting, and I would definitely include them in the paper. So thank you for looking at it so carefully.
Great. Well, we've got a couple of minutes. So if there's anyone online who just wants to speak up, just here's your chance for free for all. Otherwise, we will. So let's see. Well, I think it's everyone's just overwhelmed by all this data, and no, we look forward to seeing this progress. So I think if no one else has anything else, we will just turn to the next one, and then you've always got time to email Sandra if you've got other comments and have a chance to look at this in more detail. But thanks so much, Sandra and Francisco, and we will turn to our let's turn to our next presentation, which is Mahistra, and let's go ahead, please, Mahish.
Hey, David. Thanks. Can you see the slides? Can you see the slides and hear me?
Yeah. Yes, we can. Just make them full screen.
Okay. Great. First of all, thanks to the organizers, particularly Hillel, Chalar, and Anda for organizing this, for David for chairing the sessions, and particularly Steve for discussing the paper. This is a joint work with Mushfiq Mubarak from Yale and Ifat Sharif from the World Bank as well. So I guess this room needs no introduction that migration is a big phenomenon, with international remittances being large and also large share of the revenue for many of the sending countries. But one thing is that well-identified estimates of international migration, particularly for low-skilled workers and temporary migration, is relatively rare in the literature. What's probably often overlooked and understudied is the south-to-south migration, which is an extremely large share of the international migration flow, with like over 10% of the global migrant moving in that moving from Asia. And every year, like 2.2 million migrants from just 4 of the South Asian countries seek for work permits abroad, and most of these are for temporary, low-skilled contractual work. And Gulf Cooperation Councils are one of the biggest hosts, which house 18 million South Asians. And Malaysia is another extremely large country with 1.2 million South Asian workers. And then 19% of the global remittance flow goes to South Asia, and 59% from the Gulf Cooperation countries and Malaysia, which house a lot of these temporary low-skilled contractual work. And our paper provides some evidence on this critical migration corridor. And one of the key issues in this corridor is that of skills, is particularly voiced by policymakers, that people leave without appropriate skills, even for these low-skilled occupation. And they frequently worry that lack of such skills would lead to lower wages and potentially abuses and exploitation in the destination. So the Global Compact of Migration also calls for government to invest on skills development systems. So it's important to understand why workers do not invest in such skills. So one potential reason is that we will be able to shed some light through this paper is that there is some uncertainty in the migration prospects, which prevents skill acquisition, especially if those skills are not expected to have any returns in the domestic labor market. So with that background we answer 2 questions in this paper: is whether high migration prospect increases pre-migration skills investment, and whether such investment leads to actual increases in migration without further intermediation inputs. And then another research question that we look at is, what is the impact of such low-skilled migration on migrants and the welfare of the household? So in this paper, we look at this natural experiment in Bangladesh, which happened in the context of a government-to-government agreement to send workers from Bangladesh to Malaysia to work in the palm oil sector. So what ended up happening was that a lot more people were interested in migration than there were allocated seats. So the government decided to do a lottery. So in this paper, we basically tracked down a subsample of the winners and losers of the lottery program after about 5 years of the lottery. And we measure a whole host of outcomes that we will look. So to highlight the main results, what we show that is that winning the lottery, which we interpret as like higher migration prospects, increases investment on skills, even for low skilled work, and particularly language, as well as like food and physical fitness, which is the pertinent types of skills for the manual type of work that they would typically go for. And so the skill investment also increases, and that's sort of almost independent of whether they end up actually going or not. And then the fact is that the government intermediation, which was supposed to send workers, does send workers. We'll go into the detailed numbers abroad that we in later. And more importantly, this type of migration has a positive impact on wide array of outcomes. In particular, labor income goes up, and their households in their origins are making more money as a result. Their consumption goes up, their household conditions improve, their debt position improves, and there are some changes in how households make decisions and the composition of the household as well, and some indication that the entrepreneurial activities actually falls. So with that, I'm going to skip contributions and move directly into the context. So this is the migrant outflow from Bangladesh to other countries. And as you can see, a lot of migrants go from to the Gulf countries and Malaysia. One thing I would like to point out is that there's lots of cases, if you look at the different country by countries, where migration flow is pretty steady, and then all of a sudden stops for a while. The bright yellow is Malaysia. That's the context we're going to look at. But even like if you look at Saudi Arabia, it virtually stops after 2008 till about 2015. UAE, the same thing happens after about 2012. And this is because of the intermediation nature of the market and the concerns surrounding it. And in particular, what that means is that lots of these type of migration are heavily intermediated by informal independent agents called dalals in the context of Bangladesh, and they do provide a service of linking work to these workers in all across different countries. But there are concerns about like high cost of migration and people being misled, and then concerns of abuse and exploitation from both sides. So because of these concerns, policymakers often go on to these suboptimal response, which take in the form of migration bans. So that's the context for our context for our program evaluations too. So Malaysia exactly did the same in 2008 because as it banned worker outflow because of exploitation issue. And in 4 years, the two governments talked to each other and they decided to be more involved in recruitment and completely shut out the private sector and sort of resume the migrant flow. And to pilot this, they started with a program which would start with like 30,000 male workers in that to work in the palm oil sector in Malaysia. And then the only eligibility conditions was that the migrants would have to be male workers, at least 5 foot tall, aged between 18 to 45, weighing at least 50 kg, and be able to live 20 kilograms. So these are pretty much the selection for people who are who would be working in low skilled manual work in the palm oil sector. So in January of 2013, BMET is the organization that sort of manages all sort of employment permits for workers working outside Bangladesh. So they announced a nationwide campaign to interested applicants in these rural areas, and these registrations are done all across the country. And within a few weeks, almost 1.5 million eligible candidates apply for this program. And then in February, BMET conducts a lottery to select about 36,000 workers. And they did it quite nicely by making it sort of, the rationale was that they wanted to make it fair for everybody. And they sort of outsourced this particular lottery to a research university based in Dhaka. So they didn't do the randomization themselves. Somebody else did with a third party, with the probability of selection proportional to the size of the sub-districts. And it was focused mostly on rural areas or administratively rural areas in Bangladesh. But pretty soon after the lottery was conducted, Malaysia comes back saying that they cannot take 30,000 workers at once. So they reduced the initial demand to about 10,000 workers, and they decide to do it in phases of 3, so that over time they would reach their target of 30,000 workers. So BMET again conducts another second round of lottery to divide the first round winners into 3 phases. The phase for 1 winners would be intermediated immediately, but phases 2 and 3 would be intermediated over the course of the years in latter phases. So applicants were notified, and then phase 1 begins recruitment processes, where BMET sort of prepares all the files for the workers and sends them to the employers in Malaysia. And then once the employers choose these workers, BMET arranges for the travel. And here a sort of subsidiary analysis or complementary analysis done by my co-authors actually look at all the information that's available to the employers in these files sent there, and they find almost no correlation of anything substantive. And these were pretty much essentially just pictures. So they look at facial features and symmetry and also sorts of aspects that you could tell about a person by just looking at its picture. And there is no strong correlations on the timing of visa approval for these workers. So pretty much almost everybody ends up getting approved at some point. But at the same time, the G2G program itself faces public criticisms, and I could go into detail if necessary on the site, but and more details are in the program too. But eventually, the program comes to the halt, and by sort of what ended up happening is that lots of people in the phase 1 get intermediated, and only a small share of people in the phase 2 and 3 eventually get this government intermediation. And one of the key things to note is that since government is doing all of these processing, they pay on average about like $550 to migrate, which is about 1/7 of the cost in the private market. So this is huge reduction in cost. So what we do is that we follow the winners and the losers, both phase 1 winners, which we call T1, and phase 2 and 3 winners, which we call phase 2, as well as losers across 3 divisions in the country. And these 3 divisions, which are comparable to states in the United States, is houses about more than half of the population and about 60% of total migrant outflow. So this is usually migrant sending divisions. And for our survey, we have information that was collected during the time of registration, which include essentially their names, their parents' names, and their union, which is a collection of villages, which typically are 4 or 5 villages, which house about 6,000 households. And we have phone numbers for almost all of them, particularly the losers and most of T1. So our survey strategy, basically, if we have phone numbers, we go and try to call them and find them. If we don't have phone numbers, we go to the field and try to locate them by asking to the local officials as well as local villagers. And for T, since the number of T1s are pretty small, basic instruction to the enumerators was that find people in phase 1, find people in phase 2, and find people in the control group in an ordered list. So basically, that's how the search strategy goes. And at the end, we almost at the control group, we find about 70% of the people in the control group, which is quite high in compared to other studies, particularly given that it's Bangladesh and with the very limited amount of administrative data available, and it's the time duration between when the information was collected and when we did the survey. So that's pretty high compared to like similar survey, similar papers that tries to find workers using the administrative data. What is somewhat remarkable is that we find close to 95% of the T1, the lottery winners. And there are basically 3 reasons behind that. First is that since the T1s won the lottery and they had to do all this paperwork with the local government officials were more familiar with their whereabouts. The second was that these winning the lottery make them somewhat popular of a local celebrity, if you will, in this community, which made it easier to find them. And then even in this context, what ended up happening was that the international migrants tend to be known because either these people are sort of lots of people want to migrate and maybe they want to know information about, so the winners were likely to be found more so than the losers. So I think that sort of explains the difference in finding rates. And in the paper, we adjust this in different sorts, which we can come back to a bit later. Sure. Okay, thank you. So the comparison of the study sample, so it's not a random sample, it's people who are interested to migrate, which means that they're slightly richer, more likely to have migrated anyways, and a bit entrepreneurial. So the empirical specification is very straightforward given the randomization, and we do both IGT and IB specification where we use the lottery to instrument for migration, and we correct for multiple hypothesis testing. So what we find is that, so these are the results for intent to treat estimate of investment in skills. What we find that both lottery winners in both arms are more likely to spend in learning Malay, take some form of skills training, eat more food, and then do more exercise. So even when migration is for low-skill jobs, they are trying to invest on the skills that would be pertinent for them. And then this is the impact on migration itself, which finds that large impact of people on T1 and particularly T1 on migration, driven mostly by intermediation. We see higher in the T2 compared to the control group, and that's almost entirely driven by the difference is entirely driven by the government intermediation. And what I'd like to know is that 5 years later, only like less than 1/5 of the people were actually able to get this opportunity. So not a lot of people are able to migrate on their own, which sort of connects back to the skills story that I was saying. So for the rest of the paper, we sort of drop T2 because it sort of confounds lots of different issues. So we just use T1 and control and use T1 as an instrument for migration, and I'll present a series of results. So we do all sorts of corrections for sort of the differential finding rate, and the results are fairly robust. But let me move straight on to the IV estimates. What we find is that the migrant earning grows threefold, and that comes almost entirely from, not from the total hours that they work, but where they spend their time. That is, they are doing wage work abroad. So our preferred estimates are threefold increase in migrant earnings, but with no changes in labor supply of other household members. So there's no income effect, if you will. So the total household incomes more than doubles on this, and that's also coming from the remittance income increasing, and sort of in terms of income at home, we do see non-farm income falling. Non-farm business income falling a bit, but that sort of more than compensates for the total income that they receive through remittances after migrants working abroad. And we see that effect translate into greater expenditures on food, particularly on proteins, as well as on non-food and health expenditure as education expenditure. So on poverty, we have some mixed results, and that's possibly because our entire pool is not necessarily poor at the $190 per day, but at a higher threshold of like lower middle income countries or middle income countries, we should see a large reduction. And we see some great larger expenditure on like large expenditure item like home renovation and buying. And their housing condition improves. They're living in bigger and better houses with better structures. And so one thing that we also look at is female decision making within the household, and that improves drastically. A lot of it is mechanical because absence of male members make a female more empowered within the household to make their decisions. But we see their improvement not just on the usual frontiers like childcare and stuff, but also on big decisions, making large decisions about their household businesses and household businesses and other large expenses as well. And the applicants is sort of removed from this decision making. We sort of want to follow up on this to see how much of that would stick once the migrants return back. And what we see that the household composition also changes. And one of the interesting things that happens is that they're less likely to get married and have children, which removes the addition, but then they're more likely to stick with their parents or with their brothers. So the initial household does not split away. So that's what's happening. In terms of like household headship, applicants are less likely to be heads, with wives and parents taking that role. And they sort of are less likely to be in debt and more so from more expensive sources. And what we see is that entrepreneurship falls, and our interpretation is that entrepreneurship falls because the most entrepreneurial member, which happens to be the migrants, is moving away, is abroad. That's why this falls. We do see some descriptive evidence of more entrepreneurship amongst the migrants who have already come back.
Last minute, Mahesh.
Sure, I'm almost done. So there's some investment, increase in investment, but they're not particularly large. In schooling, particularly, we don't find anything on years of schooling per se. So just to conclude, we do see that increased certainty of migration increases skill accumulation in this context as well. So in addition to doing investment on skills by creating skills development system, one thing that would be more important is to also make sure that you provide some sort of certainty of migration, improving the probability of migration so that there is incentive for workers to actually invest on these skills. And then what I showed right now is that there are high returns to welfare gains from migration. And I'd like to point out that the government intermediation has a role to play because, and we estimate that we guess that a lot of that return has to do with low cost of migration, which would reduce the cost of migration by about a seventh. And we also see differences of government intermediation in the type of who gets the opportunity to migrate. And particularly what stands out is that people without ex-ante social network connection abroad are more encouraged to apply. And we're doing more follow-ups with the same sample now. And we do see that there's some long-term relationship forming of people who went through the government intermediation in the sense that they're less likely to have lost jobs or employment during the COVID-19 shocks. So I want to close by highlighting that the channel of intermediation is also quite relevant for the policy. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. And we're going to hand over to Steve, who is famous for wearing shorts and t-shirt to these conferences, even in normal times. So he's right at home while we're all virtually. So,
David,
Steve,
what do you think? What do you think I'm wearing in my house?
yeah, I don't stand up is all I'm saying. So over to Steve for the comments here.
Let's see, have I shared properly? That work?
Yeah, we're seeing your summary slide.
Okay. Perfect. I'm not seeing what I'm supposed to be seeing, but it's okay. So yeah, thanks so much for having me as a discussant. This is it's always a trade-off when you get handed a sort of lottery RCT paper. They're always very nice to read. It's always very hard to sound very smart as a discussant since usually they're quite clean. And as a guy who likes to comment mostly about empirical stuff. So this is, I think I'll just summarize really quickly. I mean, this is a paper looking at what happens to Bangladeshis who win a lottery, who allows them to move to Malaysia short-term to work on palm oil plantations. So it's quite specific, but I mean, it's a super nice project in the sense that it's a large in-demand migration stream. They basically exploit a randomized lottery, which has a clean first phase and sort of say a dirty phase 2 and 3, which they dropped from most of their analysis. Main findings, I mean, people are much more likely to move if they win the lottery. They invest in things that help them in Malaysia, and they get very large increases in income, consumption, and lots of outcomes that they look at the household. It's a nice paper showing that increased international mobility, even for a very low skilled group, can really make big changes in their lives. But I just have some questions and big picture, little questions and then big picture comments. Just kind of quickly, I mean, I'm a little bit worried about the stuff about the preparation side of migration, because the one issue here is that interviews are done with a kind of a mixture of the migrants themselves and their families if they're still abroad. And in the phase 1 group, a lot of them are still abroad. So you're kind of asking people, I mean, you're asking somebody's wife or maybe 5 years ago, did Steve eat a lot of food before he went to Malaysia? Or did he study Malaysian before he went? I mean, you're already a little worried about the migrants actually remembering exactly when they made these investments. But I mean, I'm pretty skeptical that the families can really do a good job kind of remembering the timing. I believe that they might know that you studied Malaysian, but maybe you started after you moved, all of those things. I think you need to think carefully about whether you can do something about this, whether you can just focus on the migrants who are back, which of course is a selected sample, so that's maybe not a great answer. The other sort of technical issue, I guess, to think a little bit more about who the non-compliers are. In this sense, only 76% of the people who win the lottery end up moving. So I'm trying to think of, whether for some of your outcomes, clearly you wouldn't think there would be sort of direct impacts of being a non-complier. But, it's something that, that David and John and I thought about a lot with our Pacific Island stuff, thinking about in what cases where maybe winning a lottery and then not being able to move could maybe affect you. And I mean, 1/4 is a fairly large group. So it'd be interesting to know a little bit more about them. I don't know how much data you have on them. I mean, you're very clear in the paper that a lot of the impacts on female decision-making are kind of mechanical because there isn't a male around. But I don't know if you can kind of go a little bit deeper. And maybe it relates to my fourth kind of question, which is, if you stratify things by household structure prior to migration, maybe you could say a little bit more in this case, right? Because if the guy leaves a house where he was just with kids, probably a lot of the change in female decision-making is really just, it's no choice. I mean, the woman has to make decisions because the guy's not there. We're in a multi-generation household or a guy that was single and living with his parents, then you would expect less changes or different changes or real changes. So maybe you could go a little bit deeper. I think that you're very clear in the paper that you also think it's mechanical. And that, you know, this is maybe something to follow up more long-term, but I think you can do a little bit more now. And then kind of my questions. I mean, I really like the paper, but at the end I was trying to think to myself, kind of, what does it tell us kind of more big picture? So one question which you don't seem to do in the paper right now is just answering the question whether you need this lottery in order to actually estimate the impact of this migration. I mean, you might think, you see some observables like prior migrations experiences are correlated with applying to the lottery, but you might think for these very unskilled workers that maybe these unobservables don't matter so much. So I was kind of interested that if you just did sort of OLS with the winners versus a general population of Bangladesh, you know, how bad would your estimates be? I'm not saying that's the paper you should write, but I think it would be interesting. And that's really has to relate a little bit to my second and third comment, because if you don't think selection is so important, maybe you could also say a little bit about, you know, how does this migration stream kind of compare to other migration streams? Obviously, low-skilled Bangladeshis, they have a lot of migration opportunities, right? They can move from rural areas to urban areas. They can go to India and Nepal kind of without intermediation, I can't say that word. Or they can go to other Asian countries like Saudi Arabia. They can go to Europe. Even half the grocery stores in Bolzano, Italy, are owned by Bangladeshis. So I don't.
Hey, Steve, last minute.
Last minute. This is my last two bullet points, so I think I'm okay. So I think it would be interesting to say a little bit, even if it's less well identified. You know, you're getting huge returns, and I'm just curious: is this something that you would really say? Can we say from your paper that if I let Bangladeshis move to other places, give them just a little bit of help, that they're going to, you know, make a lot of extra money, and this is going to be huge for development of Bangladesh? Or should I think that it's something very specific about this program, you know, that it's intermediated, that they're going to palm oil plantations? You know, how much, you know, how can I think about the results in that sense? And I'm finished.
Great. So we have a couple of questions. So let's ask those, and then maybe you can respond all together. So I see you, Dean, is well with the manual hand up. So first, a quick comment from me, which is relating this to the brain gain literature, you know, where there's this sort of prospect of migration, and then you might not end up moving. Here, it's almost like the government tricked you. They said we're going to help you. You know, you're in this, and so it's not sort of a surprise, perhaps, that I invest in stuff. You know, when I've been given this promise, I've won this lottery and I'm going to move, and then suddenly, oh, whoopsie, you know, we are taking that opportunity away. So it's a little bit different from some of the sort of standard stories of brain gain there. So I have comments from Hilal first, and then from Dean Yang.
Yes. So yeah, actually, it's connected, not surprisingly, to the brain gain question that David just asked. So I wanted to ask whether you know the type of contracts they have over there in Malaysia. You would suspect the incentives are different if it's a flat, a piece or a fixed contract. And if you have any variation here that you can exploit, if people know ahead while they are moving what type of contract they get, that can change their incentives to make the investment.
Great, thanks. And Dean?
Thank you. Very cool paper. I don't have this is beyond what your paper can say, but I'd really like to hear your thoughts about the extent to which I think your results may actually understate the equilibrium gains and equilibrium impacts of a policy like this. Mainly because you're restricting yourself, you know, to you're basically not estimating equilibrium impacts. And my fairly strong prior, backed up by some evidence as well, is that this is the gains that you're documenting could only be a minority of the full equilibrium gains. The couple of channels that are probably most prominent in my mind are remittances that the migrants are sending to other households other than their origin household. In addition, assistance in future migration. Once the original beneficiaries of the program get to migrate, they can then facilitate future migration for others. So, and that's not going to be captured in your analysis either. In fact, to the extent that some of these benefits are spilling over to people in the control group, you're actually attenuating, even within your own sample, the potential your estimate of the total equilibrium impacts. Thoughts about that? I'd love to hear your thoughts, even though that's not something that's your study is well designed to capture.
Great, thanks very much. So Mahesh, why don't you decide what you want to respond to, and you've got a minute and a half to.
Sure. Yeah, thanks a lot for all these like excellent points. So I think these are obviously a lot of questions that we have tried to answer. On the complier side, we do sort of what the complier characteristics are, and they don't seem too different from the control group to the extent that we can measure. So I think that it does apply. Yeah, so it doesn't, and I think the suggestion on stratifying by household structure is an excellent one to dig a bit more into the female empowerment issues. We do think a lot of it is mechanical, but like these are also like households with other male members. So the suggestion is a excellent one and something we should do and will do. On the skills investment side, we do ask, so I think we can look at it by returnees as well, but and we will definitely do that to check to see if that the effect differs, but the treatment, the comparison between T2, the second treatment group, a lot of whom are still back home, we still see an impact. So it's not necessarily completely driven by misreporting, and that's an excellent concern. But there are some evidence that at least like a huge part of it is true effect. And we did run the OLS on the unobservable, but what happens is that since the cost is extremely high, the OLS returns at least in our sample, are very close to zero. And that's because and we do some like back of the envelope type calculation where if you were to go on a private market, get the exact same contract and take out the debt position with similar characteristics, in two years or so, you almost have you have like effect of zero. So we do see a lot fewer. So we should on the bigger point though, we should check that in the more cross-sectionally representative data set to see how
Thanks very much, Mahesh. This is and we'd love to talk more on this, but we are going to turn over to Patricia and make sure we can finish on time here. So Patricia, all yours. We can see you, but we can't hear you, Patricia.
Yeah, no, sorry. I was trying to look for this. So you can see me and you can see my screen. Perfect. Okay, thanks a lot for including this paper. This is joint work with Semirai Kazulu and Carolina Pan. And this is very much a preliminary work, so all of your comments are welcome. And we're going to talk about labor market nationalization policies and exporting firm outcomes, and it's in the context of Saudi Arabia. We already heard about Bangladesh is going to Saudi Arabia, and they're not the only ones. Countries in the Middle East receive a lot of migrants, especially they work in the production of goods and services in their economies. If you think about Saudi Arabia, more than 3/4 of their labor force are foreign-born. They're the third largest countries in terms of the number of migrants in the country. And the prevailing social contract for a long time has been that the government redistribute oil rents by giving public sector jobs to the Saudis. And then most of the work in the private sector, especially in retail and construction, is done by foreigners. So it worked for some time, but more recently, because of the price of oil and other things, it's kind of become unsustainable. So the youth unemployment substantially increased. The government couldn't secure all of the public sector jobs for the new entrants, and the unemployment rate comes close to 30%. And the political stability of countries was threatened. The policy that we're going to look at was 2011. This is about the Arab Spring. The government was concerned about it. So many of the countries in the Gulf imposed a series of nationalization policies on the labor force. And in most cases, it took the form of hiring quotas. And in the case of Saudi, the program is called Nitakat. And that's what the program that we're going to study. So in this paper, we're going to study how this nationalization problem, NITACAT, affected non-oil private exporting firms in Saudi Arabia. Obviously, you're imposing this restriction on hiring to firms. It's going to affect them negatively, and we're just going to see how negative those effects were. And we are fortunate to have a rich data sets that cover a lot of outcomes. So we can look at exports, we can look at exit rates from the market, we can look at employment decisions, both in terms of total numbers, but also in terms of composition, gender composition, education composition, and we also have wages. So we can look at the effect of the policy on labor costs. Okay, so why exporting firms? Why do we limit ourselves to the sector? This sector is key for economic growth, and a large effect might be particularly costly, especially in this time when Saudi Arabia is trying to diversify their economy. It can be particularly costly. Exporting firms, as we know, are the most productive in the economy, and likely they might be the most resilient to negative shocks, so they might provide like a benchmark for the other firms. And of course, we have data on exports, and we don't have data on output for non-exporting firms. So that's in part also because why we focus on exporting firms. So our empirical strategy is actually very straightforward. So what NITACAT does is that sets a threshold for the minimum share of Saudis working in a firm. And this threshold is going to be determined at the industry company size level, and it's going to be set such that about half of the firms are in the medium, half of the firms are above, and half of the firms are below. So we're going to start with a very simple difference strategy, comparing changes in outcomes before and after the policy, and then we'll show you some pre-trends analysis in some of the key outcomes. So the related literature, there are kind of two literature related to it. One on the part of immigration and the other one on the part of quotas. And honestly, I'm much more familiar with the immigration literature than the quota literature. So immigration, and it's more related to the papers on immigration and firms or production. So there's papers that look at how the availability of immigrants affect production technology, and we have the case in which, like Lewis, where places where there are lots of low-skilled immigrants, firms tend to adopt labor-intensive technology, whereas the opposite in the other paper by Michael and co-authors, in which when the Bracero program was canceled, firms adopted labor-saving technology, and actually the wages of natives or the employment of natives didn't increase that much. And the paper by Ottaviano et al., they look at the role of immigrants in UK in different places and find that immigrants increase the productivity of service firms and also increase exports. Now, from the point of quotas, most of the literature on quotas have focused on the effect on workers, not so much on the effect on firms. And it's mostly about affirmative action policies, both in India and the US. Now, the closest paper to ours is going to be Jennifer Speck paper, which she has already looked at this NITACAT policy on firms. She had looked at exit and employment, and she doesn't look particularly at exports, but at exporting firms, but all of the economy. We extend her analysis in important ways, so we're going to focus on the effect on the most productive sector. Unlike her, we do have data on output, and we can say something about productivity. It will also allow us to see the relative productivity of Saudis compared to non-Saudis, because there's a minimum wage from Saudi, so they are more expensive, but we don't have much of a clear way, or we don't have that much idea if they're actually more productive than non-Saudis. So we will be able to say something about that. And we also will we'll look at how this policy has changed the composition of the labor force within firms. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the NITACAT program. So it was established in 2011. And as I said, was a threshold that was established at the industry size. At the beginning, the micro firms, those below 10 employees, were not included in the policy. And within combination of industry and firms, 3 thresholds were determined. So there were 4 different bands. The key threshold was the band in the middle, the one that determined between what is the yellow that is below and the green that is above. The top was the platinum, that are like the best firms in terms of Saudi hiring, and the red one were the firms that were really bad at Saudi hiring. Here is just, I'm going to just skip this, but there's variation within wholesale and retail, for example, in the thresholds. Okay, so what were the sanctions? First of all, it was quite enforced, the policy. The sanctions related mostly to the availability to hire foreign workers and the easiness in which you hire them. So the threshold was such that if you were above the threshold, you can use online system, you can hire from other firms. If you were below threshold, you have some restrictions, especially for the red ones that were the most farther away from the hiring quota. Basically, they made it such that it was kind of impossible to survive. You couldn't open new stores, etc. Okay, so data, we have three sets of data. We have the NITACAT data, that is the data that the government uses to follow up on the policy. So they collect data on employment levels and, of course, composition of nationals versus Saudis. And then they have the band color for each. I think it's weekly data. Now, GOSI is the social security data. And here we have job data on each job spell in the economy. It covers the entire private sector. And from here we have wage data. And for Saudis, we have gender and we have education. And finally, we have the exports data that is at the transaction level that we aggregate at the firm year level and has data on the weight and value of exports, which we're going to use. So descriptive stats, this just so if you haven't heard about Saudi Arabia before, this will tell you a little bit about their economy. Here we have exporter firms, non-exporter firms. When we look at the second part, the second panel, you see that the exporter firms are relatively large. The average number of employees is about 400 compared to the 38, and this is conditional of having at least 10 employees. The share Saudis in the exporter sector is about 20% compared to about 10% in non-exporter firms. About 50% of firms in Saudi non-exporting sector don't have even one Saudi in their labor force. That's a number that can give you a sense of how immigrant intensive is their economy. You see too that the share below is much smaller for exporters, which means that even within their industry and size, they tend to have more Saudis than non-exporter. They have a smaller share of female Saudis. Not surprisingly, they're concentrated in manufacturing, whereas the economy, most of the firms are actually in the construction sector. And the exit rates are also smaller. Our sample size here is about 1,400 for the exports. Okay, so the empirical strategy, as I said, is very simple, and I think already discussed it. So I'm just going to move to, first I'm just going to show you the firms below and above. And not surprisingly, they're different. Remember, this is within industry but this is not controlling for industry and size. But when we compare across, we see that the firms above the threshold are exporting much more. They have different numbers of employees. Naturally, they have different share of Saudis because some of them are above and some of them are below. So, but this very large difference in exports, there's about like a tenfold. We look more detailed into that. It's just a very, very large firms that have a lot of exports. So we also going to show results in which we kind of censored and drop the very extreme observations. Now, the econometric specification is very straightforward. It's the change in the outcome in industry J, in region R, in firm size on a below dummy, and then fixed effects. And we're going to show specifications in which we drop the sample doses at top and bottom 5% or limit green and yellow. Thanks, David, for the suggestion. Here what we see, I'm going to start with the effect on employment. So this is like the first order effect. And you do see that firms that were below the threshold complied, in the sense that they increased the Saudi share in their labor force, and they complied. They can comply in many different ways, right? We can see that they comply both by increasing the number of Saudis in the workforce by about 30%, but they also decrease the number of foreign employment by about 23%. And these changes imply that actually and this is the conditional on not exiting, that the total number of employees actually shrunk by about 10%, between 10 and 15%, which is not a small number. And this is true if you restrict to different samples. Now, when we look at exports and productivity, we don't find significant effects on the probability of exiting the market, although the effects are not that small. It's like 1%, whereas that's about the average. But we do see that they stop exporting. So these firms presumably produce for the domestic market and also for the international market. And we do see that it increases significantly by like 7 percentage points the probability that you don't export in after the policy. And we see a significant drop, both if we measure it in terms of value or in terms of weight, in the exports. And this is about 25-30%. So it's quite a big effect on the exports. When we look at export value per worker, right, which is not obvious what's going to happen because both the exports are shrinking and the workforce is shrinking, we see relatively large effects, but they're not statistically significant, right? So they're between 10% and 16%. So they're large, but they're not that big. Now, two things. First, this seems to suggest to us that the Saudis tend to be relatively less productive than the non-Saudis, because the share of them in the labor force in the firm is increasing and the productivity per worker is decreasing. And also, I mean, this can have negative consequences for the firms in terms of productivity, because exporting less or not exporting might make them less productive. Okay, sorry, where did it go? Okay, now finally, we have data on labor cost and composition. So what you're gonna see is that the wage bill increased by 10 percentage points, which again is not obvious because you're paying higher wage per person, but you are hiring fewer people in total. We also see that the average Saudi wage goes down by about 5%. And how we interpret this is that the Saudis that they're hiring to comply with the policy are actually low wage Saudis, which we can also see in the following row, that we see that it increased significantly the number of low skill Saudis, and this is at most high school. It doesn't change much, the Saudi employment high skill. It does increase the female share, which is one of the in terms the policy does want to do this, because when they're counting the number of Saudis at the firm level, they give extra weight to women. So perhaps it's not surprising, but it does increase the number of female Saudis, which is one of the many policies that the Saudi government is trying to, one of the goals of the Saudis in the last few years have been to increase the participation of women in the labor market. So this policy seems to have helped with that. Okay, so we do event study analysis to show that that there were not important pre-trends in the outcomes of the firms above and below the threshold. But we have to restrict ourselves to some of the outcomes because of data issues. When we look at exports, you see that there's a difference in levels, and we know that because I reported that in the first table. But you do see that from the year 2011 to 2012, there's this drop for the firms below, whereas the firms above are kind of constant. And when we look at this treatment effects by year, right? We see that before the implementation of the policy, like the changes in the outcomes were not different between treatment and controls. We see this treatment effect that I already showed you for the year 2012. Interestingly, we see that this treatment effect becomes smaller in 2013, which we interpret as there are other policies happening at the same time. There are lots of policies in Saudi happening at this point in time, so it's difficult to know where this is coming from. And also there's some survivorship bias if it's affecting the firms that are actually exporting. Let me skip the wage bill. So we do also this pre-trends and treatment effect analysis for the wage bill, and we find similar evidence that there are not significant pre-trends. So to conclude, I mean, the policy achieved its main goal, that is basically increasing Saudi employment, and this was also reported by Jennifer in her paper. However, the cost was to firms was very high. We already saw that many firms stopped exporting. And those that didn't stop exporting dropped their exporting levels quite significantly by about 30%. And there's some evidence that productivity also went down. And we also learned that on average, Saudis are not more productive, but they cost much more. And what the firms did, which perhaps not surprisingly, was go to the market and find the lower wage Saudis that will comply with the policy, and also the share of female workers increase. Now, two things to think about I have about this program and what it tells us about hiring of Saudis in the labor market in Saudi is that the rationale for quotas, for example, in affirmative action cases in the US, it seems to be like, we know we force people to have to hire people of certain groups. Maybe there are fixed costs to find good candidates. Once we go to this fixed cost, we're going to have higher productivity because we're able to identify these very high productive workers. This doesn't seem to be the case in Saudi. And finally, our analysis is very short term, right? So we look at 1 year. This is partly because there are many policies that start happening after that makes it complicated to look at the long run. But you can think that in the long run, perhaps there are things that the firms can adjust, like, for example, technology, and also that perhaps the match between the Saudis and the private sector was not great because the Saudis, when they're studying and decide what careers to do, they're not thinking about to the private sector, but over time, there might be some learning from both from the point of view of the firms and the point of view of the workers in terms of things that will improve the match. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Patricia. So, yeah, this was great, and it's addressing this fundamental dilemma in Saudi Arabia, which is that on one hand, now with the oil shock, the government is looking for more private sector job creation and looking for these exports and diversifying the economy, but they're also looking for more jobs for domestic workers. And so, as migration economists, we think, well, the way to create jobs is to get all these immigrant entrepreneurs in there, and you should be sort of encouraging immigration as a way of, we know that immigrants are often complements to natives, and we can sort of get more growth overall. The view here is very much immigrants and natives should be substitutes, and if we can just, make immigrants very expensive, then they'll have to substitute and, use more natives, and that will boost native employment. And the question is, what does that do for their goal of trying to, generate more exports as well? And so it's very nice to look at this. Now, one sort of other point of motivation was Patricia noted, well, we know the exporting firms are normally the most productive ones. And so if we see things going on in the export sector, we might think things could be even worse in the non-export sector. But I think, this very much depends on how much you can pass through costs to your consumers and how what level of competition you face. And so I would expect, if anything, the export sector to be the most hard hit by this, because, if you're a movie theater in Saudi Arabia and you get told, well, you have to,
Now there are movie theaters, like.
Exactly. Now there are movies.
They allow the movie theaters.
Yeah, now that they're allowed. But, if you have to have 3 times the wage for the Saudi movie attendant rather than the immigrant movie attendant, you just bump up the prices. And so, but, if you're trying to sell stuff internationally, you can't do that and pass it on to consumers. And so, it's not clear to me, whether we should expect this to matter more for exporters or for the domestic sector. So I had, I sent Patricia a bunch of detailed comments, but I had sort of three main things. And so I think the first one is very much around, this point around timing and sort of adjustment. How long does it take to adjust, and whether what we expect to see in the short run is quite different from what we might expect to see in the long run. And so, one interpretation of those 2013 effects is, well, there was all these other policies. The other is, well, it just took firms a little while to figure out how to deal with this. And so, or maybe it's not that expensive if once we put in a bunch of other policies, everything kind of washes out anyway. And it was, if this policy was really that costly and the other policies are sort of affecting other sectors, then you would think there was some lasting damage. And so I understand the sort of survivorship bias point here, but if these other policies are coming in and sort of affecting both firms above and below the threshold, you would still expect the original treatment effect to potentially be there. So it'd be nice to just look more at what's going on in the time horizon, or at least just sort of discuss. And if you're adopting new labor saving technologies, which I expect are going to differ a lot by industry, the ability to do that, it'd be useful to do that. So that's the sort of first thing. Second thing is sort of related to the spillover issue. And again, I think with the export sector, it's less of a concern than it would be with the domestic sector, because they're mostly competing with other firms. But there is this sort of rule that if you're a good firm, you can hire foreign workers away from the bad firms. And so if we're sort of trying to compare the affected and unaffected firms, the unaffected firms who were, may actually benefit from this, because they can now, hire some of those immigrant workers away and actually lower their labor costs. And so when we see labor costs increasing, it might just be that, you've stolen a bunch of immigrant labor from them, and the control group is sort of getting cheaper labor costs. And so thinking a little bit about that is useful. Then the third point, and I was glad to see Patricia had added this sort of comparison of the yellow and green. I mean, when you see this with thresholds, we immediately think regression discontinuity, right? We think, okay, fantastic. There's this threshold. Firms are, we want to compare everyone who's, just missed out to the ones who just made it. And I understand sample size may be an issue for that, but, we really don't want to be comparing very different types of firms with one another. And so this is where, the yellow and green is an approach there that's getting that way, but I'd like to sort of also see, let's match and sort of have the levels really close to one another, and really be comparing firms that are in sort of similar industries, similar sizes, similar, export trends beforehand. And then if we see sort of divergence, we're going to think it's sort of more credible than if we look at, the whole range of firms, and we've got, firms that were 10 times as big in exports, and we've got firms that were so far away that they had zero Saudis, comparing them to firms that were 70% Saudis. They're very different types of firms. So I think really trying to push on that would be useful. So that's the comments from me. Steve Stillman says he's got a question, so let's hear from Steve. We're under some pressure here on time, so let's jump straight to Steve.
Thanks, Patricia. Very cool paper. I'm going to disagree with David. I agree with David at one point on the RGD. I also think you do need to think carefully about the cost to the firms, because firms that are close to the threshold, if I'm yellow and I'm pretty close to the threshold, I could just hire there might be some institutional rigidities that you don't have time to go into, but I was thinking that, the solution is to just hire a lot of Saudi workers at the lowest wage possible, and you hire them to do nothing. You tell them, don't show up at work. I'm just going to pay you. I put you on the payroll, and now I'm not in this yellow category anymore.
No, actually, there have been a lot of reports of ghost workers, right? Okay. So what's interesting is that, if it was, you still have to pay them somehow, and that's not clear how much they're paying them, if they're actually, the reporter paying them. So it's interesting.
But is there a minimum wage, Patricia?
On the output, because in theory, they can just hire ghost workers. Yeah.
And is there a minimum
Yeah,
wage in
so-
Saudi Arabia, or could you hire people super cheap? I'm sorry,
No,
David.
no,
you have
no,
to-
There is a minimum wage.
wage.
Yeah. So I agree, Steve. You may want a donut design where you take people, who are just a little bit away from that threshold on either side. Hillel has
It
one
also gets to your
question.
other point that
Yeah.
the up and down firms are very interesting because they're the ones at the top have a lot of incentive to steal low wage immigrant workers, and the ones at the bottom, they're desperate. They have to hire like tons and tons of Saudi workers. So I'm not sure you want to get rid of them, but you have to think carefully about how you identify the effect for them, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. Hillel?
Yes, no, very interesting. And I was wondering if you're thinking in terms of reverse image of what we expect from more immigration, and here you have less immigration. In the immigration and trade literature, the channels for the trade creating effect of immigration are productivity, are knowledge
Yeah.
flows, but also networks.
Mhm.
So I was wondering whether you can exploit the bilateral data. Do you have the bilateral data for these exports, and to see whether the effect on exports is stronger, is driven by the origin countries of those migrants due to network effects?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think we can definitely do that.
Of course, in sectors.
Yeah,
that
hello. We're gonna
consumption goods. Yeah.
we're just gonna let Patricia finish, and I should say that I've got a message from Chala that we're meant to jump over very soon to the final room for the sort of closing thing. So Patricia, you've got like 1 minute to say.
Like 30 seconds, 10 seconds, it's over.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, I thank you. I mean, you're the best commenter in the whole wide universe. I was so happy. He sent me the comments and they're amazing, especially because we're kind of work in progress. I was thinking, just realize that because we have the data on job spills, we might be able to see if they jump from one firm to the other. Because I think we have firm, because that's how we match on firm, right? So I think we will be able to test the channel of kind of this externalities to the other firms, because we have like panel data on workers. So I think when you said, I was like, oh, we can do that. So cool. Thank you, everybody.
Fantastic. Well, thanks everyone for a great session and a great conference so far. So please, we're going to exit this room. They're closing this room down. We're getting kicked out, and we're all getting welcomed over into another virtual room. So let's all jump straight away over to there. There's no break, and then we just have the closing ceremony to go. So thank you, everyone. We'll see you,
Thank you, David.
over in the other room. Okay, bye.
Thanks.